Today we're going to be talking a lot about guitar nuts, and we're going to try not to have the sense of humor of a 12-year-old while we do it, because there's a 100% chance that we're going to be talking about these nuts. Look, stick around anyway. Welcome, my internet friends. This is Adam from Miller's Custom Guitars and the N+1 podcast. I hope you're checking that out. It's a good time. Today, I am continuing my 3-part mini-series that is all about the nuts and saddles on acoustic guitars. In part 1, we started the discussion, and I took an in-depth look at the 3 different materials that are commonly used for nuts and saddles: plastic, bone, and Tusq. And I showed how to correctly install a new saddle on your acoustic guitar. I also took a close look at how the differences in materials affects the amount of labor time the installation will require, as well as how the different materials affects the costs. If you're interested in that information, you can click the link in the description and watch that first video. And I recommend that you do, because I'm not going to spend time in this video revisiting those topics. Because in today's video, I'm going to continue this series, and I'm going to be doing a deep dive into guitar nuts. I'm going to show how to correctly install a nut on an acoustic guitar using all 3 materials mentioned earlier. I will also show a great way to shim up a nut if it's too low. Additionally, I'm going to show how to cut a nut and fit a bone nut from scratch. While doing this, I'll highlight the differences that the nut material makes and how the installation is handled. In the next video, we'll talk about finalizing the setup on an acoustic guitar now that we have our new nuts and saddles, and how to get the best playability out of your acoustic guitar. And last of all, to wrap it all up, we're going to do the most important thing: side-by-side sound samples, where we compare apples to apples and see which we like the best. I want to see if we can even hear a difference, and if we can, see how drastic the difference is. Let's get into it, and just like before, first up is plastic. Whenever you're installing a new nut, the very first step is usually to remove the old nut. Start by removing the strings and the truss rod cover if there is one. Then you can take an X-Acto blade and score around any lacquer or polyurethane finish that may be adhering the nut in place. I was lucky in my case that the nut had been replaced before, and I didn't have to do that. Then I like to use a small block of wood and a small hammer to gently but firmly tap the nut loose. Once the nut is free, the first order of business should be to ensure that you have a nice clean surface to install the replacement nut on. If there is residual glue left in the nut slot, it should be removed with a file or a chisel. In most cases, you want to ensure that the angle between the bottom of the nut slot and the end of the fretboard is a perfect 90-degree angle. It should be noted that Martin style acoustics usually have an angled nut slot rather than flat bottomed, and today we're not going to discuss how to address that, maybe someday in a future video. Once the nut slot is taken care of and treated so that it's ready to go, I turn my attention to the nut itself, and we're starting with plastic. I start by positioning the nut in the slot, and I check the initial fit. Just like when I talked about the plastic saddle in the last video, when installing a plastic nut, our primary concern here is speed. Like we discussed in the last episode, the #1 reason to use plastic is to save money. And if we're going to prioritize saving money, then we need to double down and save time as well, because as everyone knows, time is money. That means we're not going to worry too much about trying to get the length to fit perfectly, even though it is important. However, the string height is still critical if we want the guitar to play well. So that's where we're going to be spending our time and attention. I was extremely pleased to see that this plastic nut dropped right in with a perfect height and an almost perfect length. Well, with plastic, that's exactly what we're hoping for. When I first set the nut in place, in order to get a quick idea of how high or low the nut is, I use a short straight edge between the nut slot and that second fret to check the potential clearance over the first fret. In my case, I like to use my string height action card as a quick reference because I always have it handy and it's thin enough to go between the nut slots. This gives me a quick starting off point to know if I will need to shim the nut or remove material. Now, this plastic nut happens to be a perfect fit, but just as a reference, let's take a look at a different nut to demonstrate a point. If your nut is too low, you're gonna need to shim it up. And look, please don't use a piece of credit card or a broken guitar pick. You can do better than that. Guys, we can do better than that. The method of shimming that I use is one that I learned from Dan Erlewine's excellent book, How to Make Your Guitar Play Great. And it has worked really well for me. I can definitely recommend it, especially since it's not that difficult. This is a little time consuming. It works on a number of different materials, but not on everything. You'll have to try it for yourself. You're gonna need the following supplies. Check it out. Parchment paper, gel viscosity super glue, not the water thin kind. I like to buy them in a 10 pack from Harbor Freight. You'll need scissors, a cutting mat, a razor knife like an X-Acto blade or a box cutter, and a piece of plain white printer paper. You can even use empty guitar string pouches if you need. Lastly, while not required, the job goes faster if you have some spray accelerator. Cut out strips of printer paper that are slightly longer and wider than the bottom footprint of the nut blank. When you set the nut blank on the paper, you want to have maybe 1/8 to 1/4 inch of extra paper on all sides. When you do this job, you don't need to be concerned about precision, at this point at least. Squirt a blob of super glue, CA glue, on the parchment paper in a long kind of tube-ish shape, slightly longer than the length of your nut and just about as wide. Then you carefully dip the bottom of your nut into the super glue and carefully place it smack in the middle of one of your paper strips. Press down firmly to secure the paper onto the nut. Then you can allow this to harden naturally for a few minutes or spray the whole thing with activator or accelerator, being careful not to get accelerator onto your main blob of glue over by your work area. I usually like to have 2 separate zones, one zone for the glue and one zone for spraying. Let that dry for about 20 to 30 seconds before moving on. I then use my X-Acto blade, like I said, or even a box cutter, to cut back the excess paper and the glue squeeze out until it's flush with the nut material. Once the paper has been cut back so it's flush, I repeat that entire process as necessary, checking my work frequently against the fretboard until the desired height is reached. Printer paper is usually about 4/1000 of an inch thick, so you can build up your shims as much as you need over time with this method until you get to where you need to go. Here we're talking about plastic, but no matter what nut you're talking about, it'd be the same, whether it was bone or Tusq. Usually if you go too far and you end up overshooting your target height, well, the layers of paper cure in a way that makes them super hard since they're saturated with CA glue. This means that you can sand them back down fairly easy to get them back down to your target height. Shimming the nut this way results in a shim that is super stable and is excellent at transferring vibrations through to the neck because the paper and glue cure really hard. Also, it's really durable and really close to the same color as your original nut material, so there's a good chance you're not even gonna see it. It's not gonna be noticeable. Look, this is a great way to increase your nut height if it's too low across the board, But you can even compensate if it's too low on one side and not that low on the other. You can use a partial shim. What I like to do is put a partial shim on one side, maybe a couple partial shims, and then do my full shim over top of that so that it's even. And then you can sand it at the end to level it out. Once your nut is high enough, you are good. Now, on the flip side, if your nut is too low, then you're gonna need to remove material across the length of the nut. That's not too hard. You can sand the bottom of the nut. Just make sure you use even pressure and that you keep the bottom of the nut square with the front of the nut. Also, make sure you check your progress often, as you do not want to go too far or you're going to be starting over or adding a shim. Nothing worse than removing material because it's too high and then just shimming it back up. If you're doing this job, you can even use the nut and saddle sander that we talked about in the last video, but to me that's a little overkill and I usually just do it by hand. Alternatively, if most of your strings are good except for one or two, you could just use nut slotting files to bring those specific strings down. But we're going to talk more about nut files in a little bit. Once you have the nut in place and the strings at the right height, well, that's basically it for plastic nut installation. But speaking of nut files, let's talk about doing a bone nut. Now, just like with a bone saddle, the bone nut is by far the most labor intensive. However, when you install a bone nut, you're installing a nut that is made to last. Look, there are many tutorials on YouTube on how to cut a bone nut, and I'm by no means an expert, but I've done a couple of them. Here's how I do it. I start by ensuring that the two faces of my material are perpendicular to each other, checking with a square. We've talked about that a couple times today. Then, using a tip that I saw on Ted Woodford's YouTube channel, I'll link to that in the show notes, I place a small mark with my razor blade on the bottom of the workpiece, on the side that faces the fretboard, and then rub some pencil lead into it. This way I'm always certain which side of the nut is down and which face of the nut faces the fingerboard. You'd be surprised how easy it is to lose track once you get going on this. It's kind of crazy. Having that mark scratched in is a really good way to keep track. Once you have that mark in place, then I'm going to sand the nut to the correct overall width or thickness so that it fits into the appropriate area, leaving as little bit of a gap as possible. Then I like to use an old luthier's trick to mark the nut to the proper fret height. With the blank held firmly in place, I'll use a sharpened pencil that is sanded down until it's been bisected in half. I let the pencil ride across the first and second fret, and that will allow it to mark cleanly in a smooth arc against the nut. When you do it this way, the mark follows the radius of the frets at the perfect height. While I'm at it, I'll also mark the length of the nut on both sides of the nut. I then take the nut to my disc sander in order to quickly remove the excess material, working close to, but not all the way to the line. I like to leave about a 32nd of an inch on the treble side and about a 16th of an inch on the bass side. But heck, I'm not getting my calipers out here, I'm just kind of eyeballing it. I also use the disc sander to get close to the final length of the nut. I'm gonna finalize the overall length by hand later. Look, I wanted to mention that I do this with the disc sander, but you could definitely do this whole job by hand with files and saws, or heck, by using a shooting board and sandpaper that's adhered to a piece of plywood. However you do it, the result is that I have a nut blank that sits squarely in the nut slot, and it's perfectly sized as far as the width, but it's slightly oversized as far as height and length. The next step is to determine where to position the strings, and this is critical. Normally you want to position the high and low E strings about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fretboard. However, I find that actually taking that measurement, heck, it's kind of tricky, especially with the extra thickness of the low E string that you have to take into account. Instead, I prefer a method that I first learned about right here on YouTube also by watching another YouTube channel. Chris from Highline Guitars YouTube channel demonstrated this method that I use for determining where to mark the outside strings. I found it really simple, intuitive, and effective. I'll link his channel also in the show notes. Now, I've slightly modified his method, but essentially I just use regular string, like not a guitar string, like cotton string, which I stretch from the bridge pin, then wind around the tuner shaft of the same string on both E strings. And I like to make sure that I wind them the same direction that the string would be wound. I like to pull these strings pretty tight so that there's some tension on the strings. Once you got the position of the strings set, you can reposition those little cotton strings on the nut until you're happy with the spacing. Just remember that the low E string is a little bit thicker and it's gonna need a little bit more room to vibrate. You want about 1/8 of an inch worth of room, but I've had success just eyeballing it with what seems a comfortable distance from the edge of the fretboard. You can compare against your other guitars as a reference. Once I'm happy with the positions of my outside strings, I use a mechanical pencil and I carefully mark right on either side of both strings. Once it's marked, I remove those cotton strings. Up next is to determine the spacing for the rest of the strings. And you could just measure the space between those outside two strings and divide it evenly to figure out how much room there should be between the rest of the strings, and some people do that. However, there's two small problems with this method. The first is that the resulting number would be some irrational number that would be pretty difficult to measure easily. The second problem is that this measurement wouldn't take into account the width of the strings, and the strings get slightly wider as it goes across the fingerboard. We kind of want the same gap between each string and the strings get thicker, right? Because of these issues, many luthiers around the world have been turning to the Stewmac string spacing rule. If you're going to be making nuts, this is an absolutely essential tool. If you're using this tool for the first time, it can be confusing, but don't worry, I got you. Look, I like to move my nut to a vise that allows for good access to the work area, but you can do this right on your guitar if you want to. The rule tells you which direction it should be oriented on the nut, with bass strings headed one way and treble strings headed the other way, and it works whether you're making a right or left-handed instrument. The rule has alternating marks, taller marks and shorter marks. This can be confusing at first, but this just allows them to put more marks on the ruler in the same amount of space and clearly delineate between different spacings. The way that it works is actually pretty simple. You hold the rule up against your workpiece and slide it back and forth until the two marks that you've indicated line up against two marks on the rule. When doing this, just remember that whatever spacing you determine to be correct will always use the same size markings on the ruler, either long and short. You'll never have one long on this side and one short on this side. I found that there's basically always a spacing that works for the string spacing that you're working with. And you just slide the tool back and forth until you find it. But you got to remember that there should be 4 strings between the outer 2 that you're working with. This sounds like it should be a no-brainer, but this tool has a lot of spacing options. If you wanted a 3-string guitar or an 8-string guitar, this tool could probably hand it. So you literally got to count between this one and this one as there 4 strings that are at the same height between my spacing. Once you've determined the correct spacing, use a mechanical pencil and clearly indicate where each string should be located. If you want to be extra clear with your marks, you can go back and use a square and make the marks even more clear and straight. Some luthiers will even use a few passes of an X-Acto knife to set the starting point for each string. Once you've got the string spacing marked, it's time to start filing the nut slots. This is a super tricky job, but it's one that you can learn to do. Yes, you. A couple years ago, I've never done one, and now I've done a bunch of them. It's something you can learn to do. But here's a few tips if you're going to try one for the first time. Number 1, practice on a guitar that isn't super valuable, and preferably one that belongs to you rather than, say, a relative, or worse, a customer. That way, when you make a mistake, it won't significantly affect the value of the instrument. Secondly, just go ahead and prepare for the high likelihood that you will need to scrap and remake your first nut. Pretty much everyone botches the first one, and most of us botch the second one as well. Third, this is one job where the specialty tools are really helpful. Look, you can find items that are sold as nut files that are actually tiny steel pipe cleaners, or sometimes you'll see a small set of diamond needle files being sold as nut files. Look, these are not going to do the job of cutting a nut. At the very best, they're not going to do a very good job. Real nut slotting files are gauged for specific type strings. They're made from high quality materials that are built to last. But they can be very expensive. Heck, the entire set of 19 differently gauged nut slotting files from Stewmac, heck, that thing costs over $400, I know. On the flip side, unless you've decided to become a professional luthier or guitar tech, heck, you're likely not going to need that whole set. And you can pick and choose the specific sizes that you need as you need them. That's kind of what I've done. However, these files, the Stewmac sells, are very high quality and they'll last a lifetime. Everyone that I've talked to that's bought them has never needed to replace them. And Stewmac's customer service and product support is excellent, even if they do tend to have high prices on tools, and I'm pretty sure they have a lifetime warranty. Another option, and the one I went with, are the two-sided beveled nut files. Stewmac sells some of these as well, but I got the Hosco ones that are offered by Philadelphia Luthier, which are similar and much more affordable. They're a little tricky to use and they have a learning curve to them. However, I found that they're sufficient for about 95% of the nut filing jobs that I've had to do. However, I do recommend skipping the ones that you can find on Amazon, because it's kind of hard to determine on Amazon if you're getting actual real gauged nut files made of good quality materials or just the cheap tools made from pot metal that don't do anything. I've got them both and I ended up just throwing them away. Don't make the same mistake I did. Buy them from a reputable supplier. That's what I would recommend. Another tool that is really helpful is to have a thin kerf, fine tooth saw. The best place I found to get these was at the local hobby shop. But I think these would be okay to buy from Amazon. I went to the local Joann's Fabrics and asked them for a hobby razor saw. I mean, they use these for model making and stuff. They sold me these in a 2-pack for like $10. And I got these about a couple years ago and I have not needed to replace them so far. The kerf is really thin, about 10/1000ths of an inch, and the teeth are super fine. It cuts on a pull stroke. I found this to be a great saw for starting nut slots or cutting down bone blanks. Heck, but you could easily use a nut slotting file if you wanted to. Now that we've got our files sorted out, it's time to do the deed. I also like to take this task to the vise that gets the work up in place where I can easily see it and work on it. However, you could also do this job with the nut blank on the guitar too. Start by carefully lining your thin kerf saw up over the marks that we've indicated already. I like to use my left finger and thumb in an almost pinching motion and have my saw slide against my fingers. My fingers almost act like a positive stop, and it gives me lots of control. At first, I use the saw in a light pulling stroke. Remember, it cuts on a pull stroke until the slots start to form, and then I'm sure it's in the right place. I take extra precaution to make sure that my nut slots are perpendicular to the nut. Once the slot has been established, I start to use traditional back and forth sawing motions. However, I'm not going very deep here, just enough that a string will stay in place or that a larger saw will register and begin to saw. Look, I then repeat the process with each marking until each nut slot has been started. Then I switch over to the tapered nut slotting files. Once again, I'm just getting the slots established, so we're definitely not trying to go full depth here. we're just widening the slots. Personally, I found that since these slots are tapered, they tend to cut kind of wide. Because of this, I normally use each saw one size smaller in the cutting schedule. For example, for the low E string, I'll actually use the A string saw. And I'll follow that schedule all the way through the strings, so that for the B string, I'm using the high E string tapered saw, and that leaves me without a saw for the high E string. And for that scenario, I bought a 10 thou and a 13 thou Stewmac saw. Once the nut slots are established, it's definitely time to move this workpiece to the guitar if you're not there already. And we've got to get some strings on this puppy. Now, if this guitar is gonna need a lot more work done and the strings are gonna be going on and coming off and all that stuff multiple times before it's all the way done, I'll likely use an affordable set of strings during this stage and save the good strings for the final setup, and that's what I did here as well. If I'm just doing just the nut and then finalizing, then I'll probably just put the final strings on right now. You will notice that the nut is still a very rough blank at this state. You don't need to string the guitar up to full tune, but you should have decent tension on each string, enough to hold the nut in place. Now it's time to start cutting each nut slot to its final depth. I like to start with the low E, since it's usually the closest to me on the bench. The most important thing to understand while cutting these slots is how to properly gauge your progress. You can use feeler gauges like this, or heck, a fancy digital tool like this, or heck, you can use your setup card like this. However, I found that the simplest method is also the quickest and the easiest, and the best, at least for me. The method that I like to use is what I've heard referred to as the tap test. This method is fast, accurate, requires no additional tools. It just requires a little bit of expertise, which is hard to come by, but I'm hoping to give you some right now. With the string under tension, press the string down between the second and third frets, as if you were going to be playing a note on the third fret. This allows you to quickly determine how high the string is above the first fret, and you can check this by tapping on the string over the first fret. You're basically looking for the string to have a few thousandths worth of clearance. Once again, you can measure with a feeler gauge, but honestly, I just eyeball it. Do the tap test on a guitar that you know plays great, and see how high the strings are above the nut on that guitar. This is going to give you a good reference on what it should be like as you're cutting the nut. Now that you have an idea of how far you're going to need to cut, loosen the string, move it out of the way, and then use the appropriate nut file to deepen the slot, checking with the string occasionally, frequently even, to make sure you don't go too deep. When you put the string back in to do the tap test, make sure you add a little bit of tension. You don't have to tune it up all the way to pitch though. When you cut the slots, you want the slots to have a single takeoff point at the front of the nut. So the nut slot should be tapered. The slot should both widen a bit and tilt down a little bit as well, more if the headstock tilts back. I've heard the ideal shape of a nut slot described as being similar to a horn of a trumpet, but as if you'd cut it in half. Additionally, if you have a 3x3 headstock, which heck, we're doing acoustic guitars here, you can help to lessen tuning issues by providing more break angle relief on the middle two strings by splaying those out as you cut those nut slots. As you file, you will eventually get to the place where you don't want to go any lower because you've got to where you want to go. But that doesn't necessarily mean your work is done. Often there's more back filing that needs to be done to get those notes to ring true. One of the things that I've noticed as I've cut nuts is that sometimes you'll hear a weird note, like a ghost note or something, and you feel like I cut this nut slot too low and now it's fretting out, and it's actually not fretting out. If you do the tap test, you'll notice that there's still plenty of room. What that is you need to back file your nut slot, because what's happening is that your note is actually ghosting because you haven't properly back filed. So make sure you check that. Once you are done with the nut slot, You move on to the next one and the next one. You repeat until you're all the way done. Once you're all the way done, you should be left with a nut that's really, I don't know, janky looking, almost like a skeleton's teeth, like mouth or something. But it should play perfectly. Tune the guitar up to pitch, give it a play, and see how it feels. If everything checks out, and it should, it's time to move on to shaping. And if it doesn't play right, give it a tweak. Now, as far as shaping goes, you can do this job on the guitar, but once again, I like to move it over to the vise. Using a file, you want to remove excess height from the top of the nut. We usually like the wound strings to have about half of their diameter exposed and the plain strings to be just barely covered. I'll throw a graphic up. Since I'm working on the vise and not on the instrument, I sometimes grab the old strings that came off and I use those as a reference to gauge my progress. I'll also file the back of the nut at more of an angle to create even more relief and look better. Somewhere around here is when I also start to worry about the overall length. I got close while I was at the disc center, but this is where we really dial in the final length. We need the length of the nut to be perfect. If it's too long or too short, it's gonna be noticeable. Your hand touches it every single time that you play. One way that I do it is I'm gonna mask off the neck and put the nut in place, and then I'm gonna get really close with a file. Once I'm close enough that I am afraid that I'm gonna risk damaging the neck with my file, even with the tape in place, then I'll take the nut off of the neck and I'll finalize the length by hand. I like to use a flat board with adhesive backed sandpaper, but you can do this however you want. But just keep making adjustments until it fits perfectly and you can't feel the corners and the edges poking out. Last of all, I use a combination of files and sandpaper and other things to round over any sharp corners that may remain until it's nice and comfortable to the touch. Last of all, string up the guitar again with the new nut and tune to pitch. If everything is looking good, you can remove the nut for the last time. I like to polish the nut slots with abrasive core. This product is available from Stewmac and online at other retailers, and it's sold in different thicknesses and in different grits. I like it because it's easy to use and it's fast. However, you could just use fine grit sandpaper folded in half. What we're trying to do is get the nut slots to be super smooth so the string will slide through them without any tuning issues or to reduce breaking strings. We're trying to remove hidden grooves or burrs left by the filing process. The last step of nut prep is to polish the nut. I start with 150 grit sandpaper or sometimes 180, and I move all the way up through the grits. Usually around 600 grit, I kind of have a decision to make of what I want to do to move forward. Sometimes I'll take it over to the buffing wheel. Sometimes I'll switch over to micro mesh. In this case, I just kept going up through the sanding grits all the way up through 2000 grit. One of the things I love about bone is just how beautifully it polishes up. And the higher you go, it just gets more and more beautiful. However, as you're sanding, just make sure you sand out each of the scratch marks from the previous grit and before you move on, and your nut will be super beautiful when you're all the way done. The very last finalizing step is to make the nut installation permanent. I like to glue it using CA glue, but here's the deal. If you're gonna do this, we need to make things easy for the next guy. We're talking no more than 2 drops of CA glue, everybody. And we add the glue to the face of the nut, not the bottom. Gluing into the end grain of the fretboard rather than the long grain of the neck itself, it's gonna hold the nut in very securely, but also make it easy to remove cleanly in the future if that needs to happen without taking material with it. You can use the string tension to help you clamp the nut into place while the glue dries, and you're done. Look, it's obvious that bone nuts are a lot of work and require a lot of expertise. However, the materials cost is also very low, they sound great, and a well-made nut can last for decades, and they're just gorgeous, they're beautiful. But if all that sounds too intimidating for you, then you may want to consider installing a pre-cut Tusq nut. There are a few factors to consider when installing a pre-cut Tusq nut, but I'd probably say that the most confusing issue is choosing the correct nut. Graphtech offers many different sizes of pre-cut nuts, and finding the right one for your application can be confusing. Fortunately, if you go to their website, they hold your hand when trying to determine what you need. I'll put a link in the description, but you primarily just follow the steps that they provide at the bottom of the page. This sounds a little tricky, but actually it's, I don't know, fairly straightforward. The key thing to keep in mind is that material can be removed, but you can't really add material later. Additionally, if you're getting a pre-cut nut, then determining the string spacing of your current guitar is critical. So grab the old nut off your guitar and a set of calipers and get to work. You're going to want to choose a nut that's a little longer and a little wider and a little taller than what you have, and a nut with string spacing that's as close to what you currently have as possible. If you don't have an old nut to use for reference for the string spacing, you can even use the cotton string trick that I mentioned before to determine what your string spacing would be. Just thread the strings through the bridge pin, wind it through the tuners, do that on both the low and the high E string, and then you can space them out over the fretboard and then take a measurement between the two, and that can give you the string spacing. Just remember that you want about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fretboard. Once you've used Graphtech's tools to determine the correct nut and gotten your hands on that nut, well, now it's time to install that nut. If you just plop that nut into place, it's going to be too long, too tall, and probably too wide. But that's fine. Address each of those issues one at a time. You'll probably need to address the width first so it'll fit in the slot allowed. Next, address the height using the sandpaper attached to hardboard like we've talked about already. I like to use the tap test to check the string height over the first fret. Once that's dialed in, I'll worry about the overall length last. And just like with the bone nut, you can mask off the nut and use a file to get down to size and finalize the length using hardboard. It's pretty similar to the other methods we talked about. Once the nut fits, heck, you're done. 2 drops of CA glue, just like before, will hold it into place. Look, whether you use plastic, bone, or Tusq, or other materials like buffalo horn or brass, or a hardwood like ebony, fossilized mammoth ivory, or other materials, the principles that I talked about today are going to be critical in helping you to get your nut dialed in properly. But the big question remains, what difference, if any, does this make to the sound of your guitar? And how do you finalize the setup on an acoustic? Look, this video is long enough. I've already had to reset my camera twice. So if you're interested in that, you're going to have to make sure that you subscribe to the channel, maybe even activate the bell icon so that you'll be notified of future videos. Honestly, I'm excited to hear the results for myself after all this work, especially with this guitar, which has been dying to play and sound great for well over a year. I'm just jazzed. But more on that next time, because until then, this has been Adam from Miller's Custom Guitars reminding you, don't be a jerk.